The rain fell steadily the night I signed the marriage documents, soft and unyielding, as if it were aware that my life was about to take a significant turn. I didn't marry for love, I married to prevent a son from inheriting a fortune. At least, that's what I was told. His name was Edward Hale, the founder of one of the largest private logistics firms in the state. He was 68, terminally ill, and deteriorating more quickly than anyone had anticipated. I was 31, overwhelmed by debt from my mother's prolonged illness, juggling 2 jobs just to get by. We met in a lawyer's office. There were no flowers, no witnesses, just a polished wooden table, a pile of documents, and Mr. Caldwell, Edward's longtime attorney, who smiled as if this was all perfectly routine. Edward wants to make sure his company doesn't end up in the wrong hands, Caldwell explained. His son, Marcus, has been estranged for years, reckless, entitled, and a threat to the business. Edward coughed, a long, dry sound, then nodded. Marcus would ruin everything I've built, he said. This marriage, it triggers the inheritance clause. The clause was straightforward and harsh. If Edward remarried, his spouse would become the primary heir and decision-maker instead of his biological son. After Edward's passing, I would manage the company in trust and sell it according to his wishes. The son would inherit nothing. In return, my debts would be erased. My mother's outstanding medical expenses, settled. A monthly allowance for life. I hesitated. Why me? I asked. Edward gazed at me with weary, sincere eyes. Because you don't desire this life. And those who don't crave power are the safest to hold it. I agreed. The wedding lasted less than 10 minutes. Edward's house was vast yet devoid of warmth, high ceilings, cold marble, walls adorned with awards instead of family photos. He mostly stayed in his bedroom now, with an oxygen machine softly hissing beside him. We hardly spoke during the first few days. Then, one afternoon, I noticed a photo on a shelf that had escaped my attention before. A younger Edward stood next to a teenage boy, both laughing with their arms around each other. The boy looked nothing like the reckless monster I had been warned about. That's Marcus, Edward sighed from behind me. I turned to him. You don't seem afraid of him there. Edward sighed and sank into a chair. People change. Or stories do, I replied cautiously. He didn't respond. That night, I heard shouting outside the gates. A man's voice, angry and desperate. I just want to talk to him. Security pushed him back, but before he left, he looked up at the house and directly at my window. Our eyes locked. He didn't appear dangerous. He looked heartbroken. And for the first time since I signed my name, I began to wonder. I didn't sleep that night. The man's face kept replaying in my mind, not angry, not threatening. Just, shattered, like someone who'd already lost everything and was begging not to lose one thing more. The next morning, I asked Edward about him. Marcus came to the gate last night, I said casually, pouring coffee I didn't want. He said he just wanted to talk. Edward's hand froze around his cup. You must never speak to him, he said sharply. Too sharply for a dying man with no energy left to spare. He's manipulative. He'll lie. He always does. That photo, I said. You looked happy with him. Edward looked away. That was before he betrayed me. Betrayed you how? Silence stretched between us, heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, Edward whispered, he sided against me. Against the company. Against everything I stood for. That was all he would say. Later that day, Mr. Caldwell arrived, perfect suit, perfect smile, legal briefcase in hand. I trust you're settling in well, Mrs. Hale, he said. I nodded. I had a question about Marcus. Caldwell's smile tightened, just a fraction. I'd advise you not to concern yourself with him. He's volatile. In fact, we're considering a restraining order. A restraining order, I repeated, for trying to talk to his father. He's caused incidents before, Caldwell said smoothly. Edward's health can't handle stress. Something about the way he said incidents bothered me. Vague. Convenient. That evening, Edward fell asleep early. His breathing was uneven, shallow. I sat beside his bed longer than necessary, then went downstairs for air. The gates were quiet now, but someone stood across the street. Marcus. He didn't shout this time. He didn't move closer. He just stood there like he wasn't sure he had the right to exist in that space anymore. I surprised myself by opening the gate. "Please don't call security," he said immediately. "I'll leave if you want." "Why were you really here?" I asked. He swallowed. "Because my father is being killed." The words hit me like a slap. "That's not funny," I said. "I'm not joking," Marcus replied. "He's not dying from illness. He's deteriorating too fast." I tried to tell him. I tried to tell the doctors. Then suddenly, I was cut out. Banned. Labeled unstable. By who? Marcus laughed bitterly. "Who do you think runs everything now?" My stomach twisted. "Caldwell," I whispered. Marcus nodded. "He controls the medications, the appointments, the paperwork. And now, you." I shook my head. "You expect me to believe a lawyer is murdering his own client?" Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I expect you to pay attention. Because if my father dies, Caldwell inherits more power than anyone realizes, and you'll be the scapegoat who signed it all away." I looked back at the dark house behind me. At Edward, fragile and trusting. At the papers I'd signed without reading every line. "What do you want from me?" I asked. Marcus met my eyes. "Time. And access. That's it." The gate creaked softly as I closed it halfway. "I'll think about it," I said. As I walked back inside, one terrifying thought followed me up the stairs. What if marrying Edward didn't save him? What if it made me part of the plan to kill him? I started watching everything, not in an obvious way. Quietly, the way fear teaches you to observe. Edward's pills, the times he took them, who brought them, who insisted on being present. Mr. Caldwell arrived every morning at precisely 9:30, carrying a small leather case. He called it, updates. Inside were documents, supplements, medication adjustments, always explained with confidence, always rushed. "These are from the specialist," he'd say. "We don't want to overwhelm Edward with too many doctors." Edward trusted him completely. That was the most terrifying part. One afternoon, after Edward fell asleep, Caldwell left his case on the dining table while he took a call outside. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure the house could hear it. I opened the case. Neatly organized. Contracts, bank transfers, and a prescription bottle. I picked it up. The label didn't list Edward's cardiologist. It listed a private clinic I'd never heard of. That night, I searched the name. The clinic didn't exist. The next morning, Edward collapsed. It wasn't dramatic, no shouting, no alarms. Just a soft thud in the hallway as his knees gave out. I screamed for help. Caldwell arrived within minutes, calm as ever. "Stress," he said, already dialing someone. "Perfectly normal at this stage." "No," I snapped. "We're calling an ambulance." Caldwell's eyes hardened. "That's not necessary." I stood between him and Edward. "Move." For the first time, I saw something slip in Caldwell's expression. Fear. The paramedics took Edward to the hospital. Caldwell followed, furious but controlled. I stayed by Edward's side while doctors ran tests, real ones, not the ones Caldwell curated. 2 hours later, a young resident pulled me aside. "Mrs. Hale," she said carefully, "your husband's blood work is unusual." "Unusual how?" "He's been taking medications that actively weaken cardiac function. In combination." I felt cold all over. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying this doesn't look like natural progression." When Caldwell tried to enter the room, hospital security stopped him. Edward woke up that evening, confused and frightened. "I didn't want trouble," he whispered. Caldwell said hospitals would only make things worse. I held his hand. "Edward, when was the last time you chose your own doctor?" He frowned. Thought hard. "I don't remember." That broke me. Later that night, Marcus appeared at the hospital, escorted by a nurse. Edward stared at him like he was seeing a ghost. "Dad," Marcus said softly. "I tried to warn you." Edward's eyes filled with tears. "I thought you hated me." Marcus shook his head. "I hated what Caldwell was doing to you." In the hallway, a detective introduced himself to me. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "we believe your husband may be the victim of attempted long-term poisoning." My legs nearly gave out. "And the lawyer?" I asked. "We're looking into him." I looked through the glass at Edward, frail, breathing, alive. I had married him to block an inheritance. Instead, I'd walked into a trap built years ago. And now I understood the truth. The inheritance clause wasn't meant to protect Edward. It was meant to control who would be blamed when he died. The police didn't arrest Caldwell right away. That's how these things work, the detective told me. White-collar crimes move slowly. Evidence must be airtight. Meanwhile, Caldwell was released, free, furious, and very aware that I was no longer useful to him. Edward stayed in the hospital under constant monitoring. For the first time in months, his color began to return. He was killing me, Edward whispered one night, staring at the ceiling. And I let him. You trusted him, I said. That's not a crime. But cutting Marcus out was, he said hoarsely. I believed every lie, that my own son wanted my death. The next morning, Caldwell visited. The hospital allowed it, one visitor, 10 minutes. He stood at the foot of Edward's bed, calm as ever. Too calm. This is all a misunderstanding, he said smoothly. Stress can distort perception. Edward didn't respond. Caldwell turned to me. You've been very disruptive. Funny, I replied. I was thinking the same about you. His smile vanished. You don't understand the machine you've stepped into, he said quietly. The board listens to me. The shareholders trust me. When Edward dies, and he will, the company will need stability. Edward spoke then, voice weak but clear. You won't be there. Caldwell laughed. You think you can remove me? I am the company's legal spine. I leaned closer. Not when your name is on every forged prescription. For the first time, Caldwell lost control. You were supposed to be temporary, he hissed. A signature. A widow. That's all. The detective entered the room right on time. Mr. Caldwell, he said, we're placing you under arrest for medical fraud, elder abuse, and attempted murder. Caldwell didn't resist. He just stared at me. You think you won, he said softly. But everything Edward owns, it's still in limbo. After he was taken away, Edward asked for his lawyer. A different one, he added firmly. That afternoon, we amended the will. The inheritance clause stayed, but with one crucial change. Marcus was reinstated, not as an heir, as a partner. Edward's hands trembled as he signed. I don't deserve forgiveness, he said. Marcus squeezed his hand. Then earn it. By living. Weeks passed. Edward grew stronger. Caldwell's case unraveled quickly once auditors got involved. The board turned on him overnight. But danger hadn't fully passed. One evening, Edward looked at me and said, you know, if I die now, everything still falls on you. I met his gaze. Then we make sure you don't. That night, I realized something frightening and profound. I hadn't just married Edward to stop a son from inheriting. I had become the last line standing between a man and the people who wanted him dead. Edward came home in early spring. The house felt different, lighter, like it had been holding its breath and finally let go. Marcus moved into the guest wing, not as an enemy, not as a replacement, but as a son trying to rebuild what had been broken. We were careful now. New doctors, independent specialists, medications triple-checked, every document reviewed by two separate firms. Edward's strength returned slowly, but it returned. Too slowly for Caldwell's allies. That's what Marcus discovered first. They're moving assets, he told us one night, spreading documents across the dining table. Shell companies. Emergency clauses Caldwell buried years ago. Edward closed his eyes. He designed the company to survive me. Or consume me. The board called for an emergency meeting. They wanted Edward declared mentally unfit. I went with him. The room was all glass and steel, cold, familiar, hostile. Men and women in tailored suits studied Edward like he was already a memory. You've been hospitalized, one director said. Your judgment is compromised. Edward opened his mouth, but I spoke first. You mean the hospitalization caused by a lawyer who's now in prison? Silence. Marcus stood. And the financial irregularities you're ignoring. Those will be public by morning. They hadn't expected us to come united. Edward placed a document on the table. This company doesn't belong to Fear anymore. Effective immediately, I'm stepping down. Murmurs erupted. And appointing interim leadership, he continued. My son. And my wife. They tried to object. They failed. Over the next weeks, Caldwell's entire network collapsed. Deals reversed. Accounts frozen. Executives resigned quietly, desperate to avoid charges. One afternoon, Edward found me in the garden. "You don't have to stay," he said gently. "The contract is fulfilled. You're free." I looked at him, really looked. At the man who'd almost been erased. At the life we'd fought back from the edge. "I didn't stay because of the contract," I said. "I stayed because you needed someone to notice." He reached for my hand. "Then stay because you want to." I squeezed his fingers. "I am." The final blow came a week later. Caldwell pleaded guilty. In his statement, he admitted the truth. The inheritance clause was never meant to block Marcus. It was meant to transfer blame. A wife who married for money. A grieving widow. A perfect villain. Instead, he'd underestimated one thing. Attention. And love that grew where manipulation was meant to end. That night, Marcus raised a glass. To unlikely allies. Edward smiled. To second chances. I looked around the table, feeling something settle inside me. The inheritance clause had nearly destroyed a family. But rewriting it, that saved one. A year later, the company was no longer a battlefield. Edward still walked slower than before, but he walked, without oxygen, without fear. The doctors called his recovery remarkable. Edward called it attention, given at the right time. The boardroom had changed too. Glass walls replaced closed doors. Financial reports were public. No more secrets disguised as strategy. Marcus had grown into the role no one ever allowed him to have. Not reckless. Not entitled. Just careful, thoughtful, and determined not to become his father's shadow, but his continuation. One evening, Edward and I sat on the porch watching the sky turn gold. "You know," he said, "I married you to block an inheritance." "And I married you to escape drowning," I replied. He smiled. Funny how survival makes room for something real. The legal end came quietly. Caldwell was sentenced to 25 years. His name became a case study in law schools: what happens when trust replaces oversight. I received what the contract promised: financial security, freedom, options. But I didn't leave. Instead, Edward rewrote the final clause of his will, this time fully conscious, fully informed. Not to control the future. To protect it. The company established a medical oversight foundation, independent advocates assigned to vulnerable patients with wealth or power, people at risk of being managed into silence. It was my idea. Marcus insisted it be named after the thing that saved his father. The clause of care. On our anniversary, not of marriage, but of truth, Edward asked me a question. "If there had been no money," he said, "no contract, would you still have stayed?" I didn't answer right away. I thought about rain on hospital windows. About signatures made in desperation. About how close we came to losing everything. "Yes," I said finally. But only because we chose to see each other. He took my hand. No tremor. No fear. "Then this," he said softly, "is the inheritance that matters. Not the company. Not the money. But the lesson we almost learned too late. Love isn't born from perfect beginnings. It's born from paying attention. And choosing not to look away. And this time, no clause could ever take that from us."